Well, welcome everybody to our third release of the Aerosol study for performing arts. Happy here today to have our two lead researchers as well as my co-chair, Mark Speed. For introductions, my name is Dr. James Weaver. I'm the Director of Performing Arts and Sports for the National Federation of State High School Associations. I'm going to allow Mark to introduce himself, and then we'll have our researchers introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Mark Speed, President of CBDNA, the College Band Directors National Association, as well as Director of Bands at Clemson University.
All right, and Dr. Miller.
Hi, I'm Dr. Shelley Miller, Professor of Mechanical Engineering at the University of Colorado Boulder.
And Dr. Schubert.
Hi, my name is Yelena Strebic. I'm Professor of Mechanical Engineering at the University of Maryland.
Great, and thank you guys for joining us today. We're really excited for our third release. Before we get started, I do want to throw a huge thank you to all of the work you've done to do all of the research and study that's been happening. I know it is not easy, and it is a lot of pressure being thrown at all four of us that are on this call. So we're very excited for all the work you have been doing to try to save our performing arts groups as we navigate what this pandemic means for the United States. Also, I do want to throw a shout out to all of our sponsors that have made this happen, especially all of our lead sponsors that have really put forward some matching grant opportunities to make the funding of this research happen. As we know, this research is not inexpensive, but if we're going to do it right, we're going to spend the money and make sure it is done right. And I believe we have done that. So I do want to thank all of our coalition members and all of our sponsors, both financially and non-financially, for making this project happen. So with that, we are very excited to be able to run through our third release of information, and I'm going to share my screen. Those of you who have seen our past presentations, you'll know that this may look a little bit different because it's just a Word document, but we're going to send this Word document out to people and have it posted on the Aerosol page for everyone to access so they can see what's going on there. What we're going to do today is Mark and I are going to run through the overview, the one-page overview of the current study results, and then we'll have a casual conversation with our lead researchers and be able to kind of explain what has been going on in the lab and what these results really mean for us in the performing arts world. So as you can see on your screen here, this is all the information we'll be putting out in the next little while. And you'll be able to see what's going on here until we get to the end of our research project in December, January, moving forward from there. So let's jump into what the one page is going to say. So here we have our introductions. One thing that I'll remind everyone that these results are still preliminary as we're working through. These are being provided to assist in a safer return to the performing arts activities world. The study focuses strictly on the distribution of respiratory aerosols that is generated while playing woodwind instruments, singing, acting, speaking, dancing, and in a simulated aerobic activity. These aerosols may potentially contain a virus. The study did not use a live virus and therefore cannot be used to determine specific infection rates. However, the study is based on previous research that shows the virus, which causes COVID-19, can travel in respiratory aerosols. This study, when was designed to identify performing arts activities that generate respiratory aerosol, including volume, direction, density, mitigation strategies. Aerosol is defined as a solid or liquid particle suspended in a gas. We say all of this so everyone knows what the parameters are that we're talking about, right? So we are not live infecting people to see what they do when they go and infect other people in performing arts activities. We are using our best knowledge to figure out how aerosols travel and what they can and cannot do. We are entering our fifth month of a 6-month study utilizing 2 independent labs at the University of Colorado Boulder and the University of Maryland. Mark, if you want to go and take the next one.
Sure. So we did find out early on that wind instruments and singing do in fact produce aerosol, which can vary by instrument and person. Reduced aerosol amount is on average similar across all instrument types and singing, with the exception of the oboe. Most aerosol is being expelled from the bell of the instruments and from the mouth of the performers.
Yeah, I do want to ask our researchers a question on that. That is because the fluid dynamics, right? Path of least resistance. That's why we're seeing most aerosols coming out of the bell.
Yes, that is correct. The aerosol just goes right through the bell, following the fluid flow lines.
Perfect. Because I get asked that a lot of times. At this time, it appears that players wear surgical style masks with a slit for a mouthpiece and bell covers. Aerosol emissions is reduced between 60 and 80%. And we have some visuals we'll get to here in a little bit. Mark, do you want to talk about flutes?
Yeah, and we were surprised to find, and it's been confirmed, that flutes create a minimal amount of aerosol, and it is recommended still, even though they don't produce much aerosol, that they play with a surgical mask with their head joint between their mouth and the mask. And this is to stop large droplets and any aerosol that may be coming out.
And Elena, the reason why we're doing that is because we want to make sure that as they blow straight out, they're stopping whatever particles are coming out of the mouth, right?
Correct, because you would assume that mouth is in this situation kind of being replaced by the instrument's bell.
Great, thank you. Bell covers for woodwinds and brass should be made with a multi-layer cover, the center layer being made of a MERV 13 filter material. Or you may use a 3-layer surgical style mask using a standard such as the GBT 32310 standard. An example of this, let me cover this up. Example of this is this handy box that you're able to buy at most of your favorite retailers. And it comes with, it's a 3-layer with a melt blown FP layer in there that stops the droplets and dust that occur. Singers produce aerosol at a similar rate as woodwinds and brass, as Mark discussed earlier with all the instrument types. The amount of aerosol varies depending on the consonants, the vowels, the intensity, and pitch. Singers wearing a well-fit 3-layer surgical style mask can reduce their aerosol emission as well. And we'll cover that here in a moment too. Mark, you want to talk about face shields and plexiglass partitions?
Yeah, we've all seen a lot of people wearing face shields in place of masks, and these are really only effective for stopping larger droplets in close proximity. They do not stop or prevent aerosol from being inhaled or released unless there's also a mask being worn. So, we want to caution everybody about these clear face shields that you see. They're really just for close proximity and will not provide much protection at all.
And if I can do a follow-up with Dr. Miller as well, that's because the cloud's going to 3D cloud, right? So like as soon as that builds up, it's got to go somewhere.
Yeah, when the droplets come out of your mouth, the very largest ones can just impinge on the plexiglass, but most of the rest of them are smaller and can just flow right around the plexiglass. And then you can inhale everything else under the plexiglass. I'm sorry, is that what it's called? The plexiglass?
Face shields. Yeah, it's a plexiglass.
Face shields.
Yeah.
Plastic face shields.
Yeah.
Okay, and Mark, the plexiglass partitions.
Yeah, and that leads right into our next topic of discussion. We're getting a lot of questions about plexiglass partitions recently. I don't know where that recommendation is coming from, but we're not recommending plexiglass partitions really at this time because they impinge on the ability of the HVAC system to do its job. So you can think of these plexiglass boxes as little containers of aerosol, and the HVAC system can't efficiently get rid of them if you create like a room within a room. So Dr. Miller, you want to talk about that, or Elena?
Yeah, I was just going to provide maybe another analogy that might be helpful or not. But I usually talk about air the same way you would, or think about air the same way you think about water. So just imagine if you put partitions inside of your swimming pool in an effort to make it cleaner, that definitely would not be the case. And maybe my colleague Shelley has another better explanation.
Yeah, the airflow patterns in a room are very unpredictable, and we generally think that the well-mixed approach of letting the HVAC do all of the air movement and providing the air cleaning is really the best approach. And it's really hard to predict where the dead zones of high aerosol concentration might occur if you have these barriers all around you. And the only place you're going to want to have a barrier is when you're within about 8 inches of somebody. That is where you might get sprayed with some droplets. But otherwise, past 8 inches to farther, you're going to be inhaling aerosol, and plexiglass barriers and face shields don't help.
And Elena, that's where you made the supermarket reference, right? So we see all the barriers in the supermarkets because you're in closer contact to those, the retailer folks that are working there. Correct.
And if there is a practical implication to what my colleague nicely described, it's basically you might improve condition for 1 or 2 people in the space that you're partitioning, but then majority of your population or occupants would experience worse condition than if there were no partitions. So it's kind of a tricky thing that we cannot say just everybody will be worse off, but on average, many more people would experience worse environmental conditions than if there were no partitions.
It's fascinating. Sorry. I love the science stuff of this, so I nerd out a little bit. So it's fun for me. Next thing we have is our rehearsal space recommendations in order of preference. So by far, everything outdoor rehearsals using individual mitigation techniques, as we've described above already, is the ideal scenario. However, we also realize that we live in North America and winter is on our doorsteps, even though it's almost 80 degrees where I am at right now in Indiana. That won't last very long. So we know that we're going to have to be moving indoors. So the next step we go is the indoors with elevated outdoor air exchange rates from HVAC systems, or indoors with typical outdoor air exchange rates. But then we have recirculation air through MERV 13 filters or an addition of appropriately sized HEPA air cleaners. Very important there. The last one we have is the indoors with outdoor air exchange, from open window supplemented with appropriately sized HEPA air cleaners when airflow is reduced under certain outdoor wind conditions. I would say, and I'm throw this to Shelly and Yelena, that we don't want to see the closet sort of classroom, right, where there's no windows, no real airflow, and closed doors. That's something we definitely don't want to see.
Yeah, those spaces should just not be used at this time. There's just not, unless there's just one person in them.
And I would just add that that would violate ASHRAE, American Society of Heating, Ventilating, and Air Conditioning Engineers recommendation given in the standard 62.1, which is related to ventilation requirements. So schools have to follow those recommendations, and the spaces that are used in the schools, for example, are designed to satisfy those conditions, and that requires minimum amount of air per person in the space.
Great. That was standard 62.1. Is that right?
Correct.
Mhm.
Great. So we'll make sure that in our resources, after this recording is over, we'll make sure we have that standard available somewhere in the resources. We can at least read part of it. I know some of the standards aren't publicly available, but I assume, and Yelena and Shelley, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I assume that most of your facilities management people in the schools will have access to those standards.
Yeah, and they should be using them. I mean, there are some states that, or some locations that do not follow ASHRAE standards, unfortunately, but most do.
Perfect. All right, and that's a great segue because our last thing we have here is referring to the Association for Heating, Ventilation, and Air Conditioning Engineers guidance on ventilation. So make sure you check that out. Mark, you want to run through some general procedures for us?
Sure, and I think many of you are familiar with these recommendations which came earlier in our study, but masks should be worn at all times, whether indoors or out. Multi-layered bell covers should be used by all wind instruments, and CDC guidelines for social distancing of 6 feet with a little bit extra space for trombone players should be followed. And then if you're indoors, limit your rehearsal time to 30 minutes, followed by a minimum of 1 air exchange rate, preferably as many as 3 or more, to change the air with outside air. And then increasing the ACH, air change per hour, to HVAC maximum, and adding HEPA filtration designed for the size of the room will provide additional risk management. And of course, practicing good hygiene, washing hands, using sanitizers, and taking care of where we're releasing the liquid from the instruments is important.
Great. And I'll open this up to Yelena and Shelley on any comments you have on what it is like to play with wearing masks or any other timing or distancing components we have in these recommendations.
I did want to add something about the masks. I have a lot of people asking me questions about why should we be playing with a slit when you put a mask on and you put a slit in it and then you put the wind instrument mouthpiece behind the slit to play. Isn't that just making the mask not work? And I would like to offer that what is important is also that the mask is covering your nose and that you have it tightly fitted on your nose so that you're not inhaling any potential aerosol while you're playing. It's true that there is now a hole, but it will still block the droplets from flying out, and much of the airflow will be attenuated. So it is very effective still, even though it seems a little strange.
Well, and we should also note too that these particular mask with slits are only supposed to be for performance time, right? So if you're not performing, that mask is not the mask you should be wearing at the moment. One thing I've been recommending to teachers and other administrators is that you should have your normal mask hanging off your ear. And so you have your performance mask on. When you're done playing, you bring the other one over, you hook it up. When you're ready to play, you unhook, you let it dangle in your ear and go that route. Because that slitted mask is only for the act of physically playing at the moment. Is that correct?
Yes, that is a great way to describe it.
And I would also add, James, that in my rehearsals, and I would recommend everyone do this, you institute a no talking policy with those slitted masks. So you can talk when you put your regular mask back on, but not with the slitted mask.
Yeah, and I agree with a no talking policy during rehearsals anyway. So this is actually should be a little bit more for all of you out there who want the same thing. All right, should we dive into some data?
Sure.
Okay, so here's some emissions data that was received so far. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit here. Before I do that, I'll describe what each bar is. So each bar is the time average of each test. Each test is between 4 and 5 minutes in length, and the average APS, or the APS averages over 1 minute for each sample. Each test is 4 or 5 APS samples. That's where we get our 4 or 5 minutes per area here. And then the error bar shows the standard deviation of each test. That's a lot of information that I just kind of spewed out there, and we're going to have our researchers go through and tell us what this actually means. So let's, I get my scrolling wheel to work here. So let's go ahead and start with some brass. Elena or Shelley, would you like to run us through what brass is telling us?
Sure, I'll just say some brief comments and throw it over to my colleague as well. I want to remind everyone that the APS stands for Aerodynamic Particle Sizer. This is a high-grade research instrument that measures particles from about a half a micron in size to about 20 microns. These are still super small particles that you can't see. And by reference, the thickness of a piece of hair on your head is about 100 microns, so 5 times bigger than the largest particle we could possibly measure. The standard deviation bars show that, over time, there's variation in the number of particles that we're measuring. On the y-axis, you see the average concentration, which is number of particles per cubic centimeter of air. And what we're seeing is that the brass and the brass instruments all generate, between a half and 1 particle per cc in the short time that we're measuring. But when you mask the bell of the instrument, the emissions drop dramatically. And so that is very encouraging and a great mitigation strategy for musicians.
Yeah. Basically, when you look at this chart, you can see how much is being produced without the bell cover and how much it's reduced when you add the bell cover. And Dr. Miller, I think you had said in a previous conversation that it would compare to someone just wearing a mask and talking, right?
Yeah, if we see some of our previous data, what we look at is with every test, we do a reading test. So it's just as if somebody is talking. And when we measure people that are just talking, and we also compare to a belled instrument with a bell cover, it's just like talking. It's in the background.
Right. And I think that's really important for people who to understand, who are making decisions about wind instruments indoors and such, is that essentially with the bell cover and the slitted mask, we're reducing the risk to about the same amount as just somebody talking with a mask on. Really important point, I think.
And I think the other thing we want to make sure is out there is the goal of these mitigations is not to get aerosol down to 0, right? Like that's something that, 1, is really difficult to do, but 2 is kind of impractical as well, right? So if we're going back into normal settings, normal-ish settings, we just want to make sure that we're mitigating it down to a reasonable level. And we're saying a reasonable level would be around that reading talking component. Is that accurate or is that not accurate?
No, that's really accurate. What we're trying to do is get the risks down to be a really low level. And with all this layered strategy, we are accomplishing that. I mean, it actually takes a fairly significant effort on our part to create an outbreak. I mean, we have to be doing we have to be generating a ton of aerosol. There has to be a ton of people in the room. There has to be no ventilation. You have to be in there for a long time. And all of these series of unfortunate events is what causes an outbreak with, we've seen that with singing. Here we're layering on all of these approaches to reduce that risk to very low levels. And risk is never zero. I mean, you walk out your front door and you encounter risk. So it's just part of how we live our lives. And I think this layered approach is getting us to where we need to be to play music safely indoors.
We're just, as a human species, really good at doing everything wrong, right?
Yeah. And we're very bad at assessing risk because we're not experts at risk assessment. And so we do a lot of things that are very, very risky, like texting while we're driving, right? And then we also avoid things that are not risky at all because we think they're very risky. And so we're not great at assessing risk.
Exactly. And I would just add that this business of risk reduction that we're discussing here is really related to aerosol transmission. Mm-hmm. And there are many other ways to reduce the risk, just as Mark was mentioning, policy of no talking, keeping 6 feet distance, being mindful of how, what mask you're using, how tight seal is around the mask. So all of those procedures are aimed at the same thing, which is risk reduction. And what we show here that your risk from aerosol transmission becomes negligible, but does not get you off the hook for other mitigation strategies that equally important to be implemented in, again, to reduce the risk.
That's a great point. It's the all of the above strategies, right?
Correct.
Yeah. All right, perfect. Well, let's go ahead and we'll just kind of briefly cover these next two. This is the one with Woodwinds. And I'm just going to point out some highlights here. You can see where the flute is. That's pretty low. And one thing we're going to show too is I'm going to come back. I want everyone to look at the saxophone levels right here, because when we get to our next chart, I'm going to point something out with saxophone and make sure that I'm correct with our researchers here. This is real-time fact checking because we have not discussed this in advance. So this should be a lot of fun. But you can see here what we'll do. You see we have higher levels of emissions with the oboe, as we described above, but pretty effective mitigations when we start adding the bell cover and the facial mask.
If I could add the difference between the graphs, the y-axis is scaled differently. And so on the brass, the maximum, if you go up, you'll see that the trumpet has the highest level and it goes above the 1.5 line. When you go down to the woodwinds, you'll see that also the clarinet passes the 1 line, but the oboe passes the 3 and 4 lines. So that's generating at least 3 to 4 times, more aerosol than we see from other instruments, which is why we wanted to highlight that. But the other instruments are reasonably similar.
James, we came up with a hypothesis, I remember. I don't think we've shared this publicly, about why these charts would look the way they do, especially the flute, which going into the study I thought would be the worst. But we hypothesized that you need a wet vibrating surface inside the mouth area to produce aerosol. So if you think of speaking or singing, it will be the vocal cords producing the aerosol. And then on a reed instrument, you have a wet reed and a really tight airstream going past this wet surface producing aerosol. And then on a brass instrument, inside the lips wet, and then lips vibrating as the air passes. So all these activities produce aerosol because of the wet vibrating surface, whatever it might be. And I think that's a reasonable hypothesis as to why the flute is so low compared to the other ones.
Right, because that wet vibrating surface is in theory breaking apart the larger particles and creating the aerosolization of those larger particles.
Right.
And you don't have that in the flute or the recorder. Yeah, we don't have the recorder data on here, but the recorder data is very similar to the flute. Again, no vibrating surface, very similar result with the flute. All right,
Yeah,
and then,
if I could add something else about the flute that is really interesting is that you have a surface that or air stream that needs to turn 90-degree angle within the instrument. So your jet actually impinges or hits the surface of the fluid before it's able to turn around, and that gets rid of a lot of aerosol right there on the spot.
that's a great point too, because angles really matter, right? This is one reason why we see the saxophone being so low and the bassoon being so low. They have really hard angles and long angles to maneuver around. Perfect. This is our theatrical speaking and singing slide here. So this is if you think of monologue style speaking. So the teacher voice, how I like to describe part of that. You'll see the same sort of trends as we've seen with the others. These are not being used with any sort of special design masks. These are those 3-layer masks that we discussed earlier on in the recommendations. One thing that I've asked, and I just want to throw this hypothesis out there to Elena and Shelley. The reason why we're seeing so many more in the soprano versus the baritone, this is a common known thing. The higher the pitch, the more vibration. So the higher the pitch of the vocal cords, the more they're vibrating, the more they're breaking apart aerosols. The lower the pitch, the less they vibrate, the less aerosols.
That seems reasonable. And I think there is another study that does show with speaking, the loudness and how you're speaking really does generate more aerosol if you're doing it louder. And then also we do see a very big difference on the note that you're playing or singing. And if you do note, the singer has the highest bar, again, gets close to the 1 line. So, you know, everything is, as you said in the summary, is releasing about the same amount of aerosol on average, except a few that are lower and higher, which is the flute and the oboe.
Perfect. All right, so here's the graph I was describing before. And what we did here is this is the efficiency calculations of how effective the mouthpieces are, or excuse me, the bell covers or the face mask is for the different kinds. You'll see here we put this in order of percentage of efficacy. I want to show this before anyone's like, whoa, the saxophone is really not effective. The reason I wanted you to remember what the saxophone looked like before, and I'll zoom back in here as we scroll up, is the saxophone is right here, and we're registering about a 0.25, if I read that correct. So we started at 0.25 and then we lower it by 64% from there. That's a pretty significant amount of lowering of the aerosols.
Yes. When you start at a low level and then you try to get it even lower, it doesn't look as impressive, but it's still very, very effective.
Perfect. And so you'll see here where we said, this is why we say the mask efficiency is between 60 and 90% reductions in the aerosols being expelled out of the instrument or the singer or the voice or the speaker, whichever one we're using at the moment, is because we do only have that 64%, so we're being honest with that. But you can see here, most of them are 80% and higher as far as what they're being, the efficacy of the mask or the bell cover. Now, I will say as a caveat, this is a properly worn or properly used bell cover and mask, right? This isn't just, I have one around my area, so it should be effective. This is one that's being worn properly or is being used properly as a bell cover.
And I would also add that, these measurements are always made in the front of the singer and also by the bell. And so we haven't spent a lot of time probing whether the mask is ill-fitting and what's going on with the side of the mask.
Perfect. And that just shows, like, if it is a perfectly or well-fitting mask, then that measurement should be accurate.
Yeah.
Okay. And see here, just as a caveat, the measurements here are taken at the participant's mouth, because obviously we don't have a bell to make these measurements. So if anybody's wondering what that asterisk means. Another question here, and then we're going to kind of zoom down to some CFD modeling. So right in here, we have asked several times, well, what about all the keyholes in woodwind instruments, right? The aerosol has to be spewing out of there. So we looked at the clarinet, and I'm just going to describe this real quick, and then we'll let Yelena and Shelley tell me where I'm right or wrong there. And so here we have the bell uncovered with our test, which you saw up in the bar graph earlier. And then we covered the bell and put the bell in the keyhole in a box and played. And you see that we had a pretty big drop in the amount of aerosols being produced. And then we had the bell covered with the bell only in the box. And you see we're about the same as the bell and the keyholes. And then we had the bell cover with the keyhole in a box. And you see we go up a little bit. And then we had the bell uncovered here again, just to prove that these are about the same. Then we go down here where we change our sampling direction. So we have a sample near the bell with the bell uncovered. So we're getting about that level of aerosols, close to 1. And then we sampled near the keys with the bell uncovered. And you'll see we have not a lot of aerosols coming out of the keys. Then we covered the bell and started sampling by the keys. And you'll see we do have a little bit of backage up with the aerosols, but we're still at a 0.3. And notice an uncovered, unmitigated is near 1. So we're still showing that that bell cover is being effective. And then we sampled near the bell with the bell covered again. And so you can see here that we have a very similar amount of aerosols with a 1/10 of a concentration per cubic centimeter. So what this I'm seeing, if I were to make a guess on this in my non-scientific sense, is that we're seeing that even with the bell being covered and the keyholes not necessarily being covered, we're still seeing a dramatic reduction of the aerosols overall that's going out into the environment.
Yes. I think that what we see when we do the flow visualization is that you see the flow coming out of the keys. There's a little bit, but we don't see a lot of aerosol coming out of the keys.
And I think, James, it might be good to point out that although we did show a picture of a clarinet inside a bag during the first release of the study, that was really testing the amount of aerosol inside the bag, not really a mitigation strategy. And I think a lot of people mistook that to mean, okay, we have to put our Woodwind instruments in a bag. We never made that recommendation, and there's no evidence that that would be an effective means of really reducing the aerosol much. If we use the strategies we've already discussed, the amount of aerosol coming out of the Woodwind instruments is very minimal.
In fact, Mark, I would actually underscore your statement by saying if you were to put a bag over your instruments, as you can see on the second peak or third peaks, if James could point it, you would be capturing so little. So it's a really kind of not a winning proposition there. And besides these particles or amount of particles being dramatically smaller, what you have advantage of now is not just the concentration of particles, but also the velocities that are coming out of the instrument or keyholes or a mouth or something like that are so small that the release is really hovering around you for a certain amount of time, and that's where the risk gets really reduced.
That's a great point. Yes, velocity dramatically reduced with the bell cover and mask. Great.
And you know that aerosol sticking around you is kind of, you imagine the Peanuts character, right, with the dust cloud around him. Right, that was my favorite analogy that I've learned from Elena here in the last couple of weeks. That's really a great example of kind of how that aerosol hangs around you in the low velocity aerosol.
Are we talking about Pigpen or?
Yes.
Yeah, Pigpen, your little personal cloud of aerosol, and it also contains a lot of other things, like fibers from your clothes and skin flakes and all sorts of stuff.
Lovely.
Had not heard that yet. Yeah, that's interesting.
So what we'll see here then is I'm going to kind of fast forward through the next part because our people will be able to see, anyone who's interested in seeing this report will be on the website. So if you want to go and dig deep through this Appendix D, this just shows all the different aerosol produced over time in the APS data, broken down by instrument, vocal, and all those things. You'll notice here that we do have on many examples. Here's your no bell cover. Here's something we tried, and obviously you're not trying that again. Here's the bell cover in the design that we've had with the multi-layer MERV 13 material. Here's a reading example, and so you kind of see how that goes. So we can walk through this. And then just as an example, as Shelley has mentioned before, here's the concentration bar on the up and down y-axis. And the x-axis here, this is the amount of time spent in the experiment. So anybody who's trying to read these. There's a whole bunch of them. And you can see here, like on the flute, we don't even break 2. So just kind of keep that, or 0.2.
0.2, right.
Yep. All right, so look at those at your leisure. You can see here the speed of my scrolly wheel that there's a lot of them there. So now we're going to talk about CFD modeling. And this is one of my favorite parts to nerd out on because there's so much in here that I get very excited about it. So I'm just going to read the first part of Appendix E. The following you see here is a model of a rehearsal room with 7 singers present. The first model shows the placement in the airflow. The second set of models represents the difference between masked and unmasked singers in the room. The bluer the shades represent a lower risk, with yellow, orange, and red presenting an increased risk of infection. And then note here that person 8 would be your music conductor. So I'm going to walk through this real quick, Elena, before I toss it over to you to describe the science part of it. So this is the cube of the room. This is a model of the UC Boulder Rehearsal Hall with singers. So you see here we have a 12.5-ish meter room by length, a 9.5 or a 9 meter ceiling height, and a 9.5 meter approximately depth of a room. So it's a pretty good sized room, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not like out of the ordinary huge compared to rehearsal rooms across the country. You'll see here that all of the inlet air comes from the ceiling and all the air escapes out through the bottom of the room. What we're going to see here is a 60-minute rehearsal, which I think will then re-solidify why our recommendation remains at 30 minutes for a rehearsal period of time. Also important to note, person number 1 is the infected person. So that's the person we want to stay away from. Is that correct so far, Elena?
Thank you.
Great. Here we go.
I would just add my gratitude to Shelley's team, because all of these conditions are realistic. And these are real airflows, non-isothermal simulations, the size and everything that you see here as a setup. It's really based on real hall at Boulder.
So this is a model that is a real life situational model.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yelena, I had a question about P4. Why is P4 red?
Oh, because we were ambitious and wanted to do more people as a source, but just time was too tight for us to finish everything. Yes.
Can you tell everyone how long these simulations take?
Yes, it takes a long time to make them work and work right. So if you start from a scratch, you're talking a month, and then just running them to do justice to the physics transport processes that are taking place. So we run several of these in parallel, and then our server kind of crashes. So we were warned not to send too many simulations at the same time, because we have to make sure that our mesh or the things that are allowing the transport to be simulated are large enough, small. I mean, we have to do a lot of science in the background to produce reliable, stable, reproducible simulations that we will, together with Shelley's team, publish. So anybody else who wants to reproduce a study like this is capable of doing so.
Yeah, and I think that was a thing that I had to learn, because I think in our instant gratification world, we're like, well, how hard is that computer model to put together, right? Can't we just 25 minutes later and we got the thing? That is not true at all. This is a lot of work that goes back and forth in this. And I do commend both of your teams for making this work so well. All right, should we go through the results on this?
Yeah, and I would just add that if the situation was not so dire, we would not even in our craziest mind attempt to do this at such a high speed that we have done so far. Yes.
That's perfect. And then we should reference this too before we dive into these. A lot of people look at the pictures for a moment before we go in. But this is one thing that we should remember: a project of this scale wouldn't typically happen in 6 months' time, right?
Correct. Absolutely.
Yeah, at least a year for sure.
So again, people should be applauding the research teams right now. Just my own personal preference. I may be a little bit biased, but I still think they should do it.
And we apologize to both of you. James and I were really pushing you hard, especially in the summer, to get us some data as we headed back to school. And we appreciate, I think in the months since we got that initial data out, all the things we talked about back in July have held true. We really haven't found anything to sort of have to take back and say, oh, we messed that one up. So we appreciate what you did for everyone. Millions of people are back to music because of this study.
Exactly.
Thank you for the opportunity, and Helena and I just also talk about how this is one of the most rewarding projects and most challenging and interesting projects we've ever gotten to work on. So we also, while it's, it's because of this dire situation, it's also really important science and really good science and fun.
And also to add to the conversation is that your pushes and your questions and actually questions from your sponsors or our sponsors basically, and stakeholders to as a broader community of musicians really allowed us to focus on the most important items in this quest that we undertook almost 6 months ago. So thanks to everybody for asking us difficult questions. Some things were really very difficult to come up answers with, but it kept us focused in the pace. Even though the pace was rough, it gave us the direction that we would have to search for on our own.
Perfect.
Yeah, it's been a great team effort.
Well, before we end this one, let's go through some CFD modeling examples of what this looks like real quick. So, Elena, I'm just going to go through and just kind of describe what I see here, and then you can tell me if I'm wrong and then add lots of things to it. So what you want to see here is the darker the blue, the better off life is for you in this room. So if this is a life and death room, you want to be way over here in the blue part. When you get in the yellow or the greens, the yellows, and the reds and oranges, that's where you don't want to be. So unfortunately, this singer number 2 right here, he's got some problems. So let's keep that in mind. Now this is without a mask. You'll see the left 2 boxes without a mask. Then we have this ISO concentration surface, which I think does a great job of kind of showing where it really, where the cloud kind of hangs, right? And then the other one we have is with a mask. And I'll let you go ahead and describe what we have here and why this is so much cleaner than what we're seeing without the mask.
So I would just go back to our famous example of Pigpen, being that person number 1, the one that is closest to us. And if you ever doubted the efficacy of masks, I have to say that, again, based on measurements from Shelley's team, we put a realistic data at the boundary conditions or at your mouth, and you will see later at the instrument. And it shows how this cloud that comes or exists around you spreads within 60 minutes. And not only that, concentrations are lower in a case of the second case vertically. Again, I'm trying to use my mouse, sorry about that. When you see, if James could show with a mask, this spaghetti shows you where individual particles or that cloud kind of spreads around, and you can see that with the mask you have much higher concentrations, and because of the higher speeds from your mouth, they just spread around much easier. While you can see that in the case 2, if you look at these ISO concentration surfaces, which are the concentration of those particles, not now shown as the spaghetti traveling around, but as kind of concentration planes or basically values of concentration, you can see that in a case with a mask, your nearest neighbor was protected, so that human subject 2, the singer 2 in this case, did not get exposed within this 60-minute study. With masks, very good ventilation rates, and basically air cleaning and all. So masking, good ventilation, and social distancing in this particular case study clearly shows the value of implementing those policies.
Can I?
Go ahead.
Sorry, James. Can I jump in and ask a question maybe of Shelley? I know a lot of our emails back and forth have included this term quanta. Could you define quanta for us so that the average person can understand what we're looking at here?
Yeah, so quanta is a really helpful but difficult unit to understand. What it means is it folds into one unit of measure the amount of infectious virus that comes out of my mouth and that you inhale and that you get infected. So there's a lot of processes happening in that scenario, right? You have to be susceptible. You have to have inhaled enough virus to get infected. The virus has to reach you, and I have to have released the virus in order and shed the virus in order for you to inhale it. So all of that processing is encompassed in a quantum measurement. And now it's something we actually can't a priori physically measure, but we back it out by assessments of outbreaks and transmission occurrences that happen. And then we can estimate what a quanta would be.
Great, thank you.
Great. And then Yelena, my follow-up question for you in this scenario here is, even though this is after a 60-minute rehearsal with these singers and the director, our recommendation of a 30-minute still lies solid, because this is a brand new room, brand new HVAC system, high, like everything is state of the art in this particular model. And that's why we're sticking with our 30-minute recommendation.
And we assume you marched in like soldiers and never moved from your point. So when we considered our recommendations, we accounted for real world disturbances. No one was opening doors. Your HVC, again, was perfectly controlled. There were no dips randomly and so on. So when we made our recommendations, we were counting on real facilities out there. So yes.
Okay, so 30-minute recommendation still stands.
And these lines, ISO lines and ISO concentration surfaces would look better within those 30 minutes, even for this particular case.
Perfect. I just want to make sure we're clear on that one as well.
Correct.
And before we move on, just to point out, Yelena, if you could imagine a box like this with very little ventilation, let's say Skagit County Choir, we would expect to see a lot more greens, yellows, oranges, and reds, right? Like tremendous amount more.
Correct. And you can also, another very important thing that comes to my mind is that what works to the advantage of this particular space is a high ceiling. So those particles could go up there. You can imagine if this box was capped at 9 feet, this becomes much more dense and actually riskier than what you see here.
Great.
And here we have about a 30-foot high ceiling.
Exactly.
Yeah, and my colleague and I, Yelena, points out a really important point. We've been trying to parameterize and understand how the ceiling height really can help you inside. And it's a really interesting observation that you just explained, where you have a high ceiling, you have more volume, and it mixes in. What's a little bit misleading is when you have a high ceiling, you have more volume, and then it will actually indicate a lower air exchange rate, because you put a volume of air in a room and now you have a bigger volume. It will seem like your air exchange will be lower, but in fact, it also is helpful to have that high ceiling. So trying to balance those two is pretty interesting, and still a question that I'm considering.
That's a great point.
So the lower the ceiling, the higher rate of these concentrations that we're discussing about viral particles. Another thing that is really nice about simulations, we can look into viral particles, while this would not be a good idea in an actual experiment. So once you derive quanta, or the concentration that a dangerous concentration or quanta of virus that a human subject would release, then you can actually place those particles in this simulation setup and see and go through what if scenarios. So please keep 30 minutes in your mind.
30 minutes. So, and we have no problem infecting a computer, Blue Guy. We have a lot of problems in purposely infecting real people to try to do the same thing.
Not a good idea.
Yeah. All right, so then we have the same CFD modeling, but with clarinet players. So we'll kind of just show you the same sort of setup. Here's your 7 clarinetists. Here's your conductor. And then same kind of situation here, but these ISO concentration surfaces look quite a bit different. And so did the spaghetti modeling. And Elena, if you want to walk us through why the difference.
Absolutely. So this is where, again, Shelley was talking about how large space makes a difference. Even different layers in this room were differently mixed, simply because it's kind of such a large space. So the air supply is sending in certain sections of the room much better ventilation than in the others. And we all experience this in music concert halls or movie theaters. You know, in one area you would feel really cold, in another maybe a little bit warmer, and so on, or sports arenas. So this is kind of indication that some sections and some layers of the air are better mixed. So you can see that just by placing the source a little bit lower below the breathing plane, you have basically in that layer had a better mixing of air and basically lower concentration of this quanta that was released from the music instrument bell cover. So music instrument without bell cover, in this case clarinet, and the instrument with a cover. And again, what you can see here is that bell covers are really amazing mitigation strategy now, not just in the measurements that we show clearly in the environmental chamber, and we clearly show the efficiency of that particle removal, but here you see how now that translates in a real space in a lower risk for your band practices.
Perfect. And for those of you looking at home, you'll see the big ISO concentration circles here versus the one with the masks. And that is a dramatic difference, which then, just like Elena said, shows exactly what we're showing with the bar graphs up at the top of the presentation. So this gives us to the takeaways that everyone has seen. So the 5 big takeaways: mask, distance, time, airflow, hygiene. You saw the breakdown of all of that in this latest amount of data that we've released. Make sure your mask fitting is important. We've discussed this at length today as well. And then just as a fun infographic, keeping arts ed safe at schools. We're masking everything, 6 foot of different distance with masks. The timing we're doing indoors and outdoors, what kind of materials we're looking at having. Remember to wash your hands and wipe down your surfaces, and have good airflow and ventilation. As we get back into the wintertime, this airflow and ventilation, air filtration is going to be really important as we get back in there. Another thing you'll see in the release, the paper report we have here today, is you'll see a link to our main coalition report page, our FAQ page. If you'd like to submit a question, you may do so. The University of Colorado Boulder has developed a risk assessment tool, and you can find that at this link. Harvard UC Boulder Portable Air Cleaner Calculator for Schools, version 1.1 is at this link here. The CDC mask information, which has a breakdown of the standard we discussed, is here, and the ASHRAE standards are linked here as well. We're expecting a final report and publications between December and January. So you don't need to email myself and Mark on December 1st asking when it's released. Just know that we allow the research team to do what they need to do to come up with the great results we saw here today. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And so we just want to make sure that we don't push them too hard where they have a product that they're not proud and can stand behind. And so we have realized that every time we've given here's when we're going to release something, we've delayed it by a couple of weeks. And that's not, I think that actually shows that we are being prudent in what we're showing you, saying, hey, we need more time to confirm this. We need more time to make sure we've got this part done. We want to make sure the modeling is done correctly. We need another week or 2 to finish up the modeling. We want to make sure our emissions in the lab are recorded properly. So you know that even though you want answers today, we want answers today. We want to make sure the science is guiding the answers that we're given, that we are giving out to everybody here in the public. So even though it may be frustrating for some people that we're delayed, I take it as a point of pride that we're making sure what we're putting out there is exactly what needs to be put out there, and then we can all stand behind it with minimal changes.
And I also want to point out, James, that these studies are vigorous and will be peer reviewed, and that was the intent from the beginning. These measurements and studies have not been undertaken just to, give somebody an answer. These are real scientific standards and will be subject to review and published. And so we can all feel confident in the work that's been done, that this is up to the level of peer review and is good data and good information.
So before I close out, I'll invite Elena and Shelley to give any final words of wisdom they'd like to bestow upon us, and then we'll go ahead and close out and be ready for the final release of things in December and January.
I just want to take a moment to congratulate all the musical organizations out there and all the classes and the bands and the who are following our guidelines. It really moves me when a friend of mine shares a picture of her daughter at St. Olave's College practicing in their band, and she plays oboe, and they're using our mitigation methods. And I just am very proud of the work we've done, but also the effort you have all made to go to these extremes, but to still be able to play your music. And I used to play music. And it's good for the soul. It's good for everybody to continue playing music. And so thanks to you to continue to do this and follow what we recommend.
Thank you.
I would just add that the biggest validation we could ever receive is what Mark shared with us, that at present there are no known outbreaks linked to the playing of music in bands. So that's actually better than any other kind of validation we could ever receive on our published study that will come in a more in a smaller setting as regarding to our colleagues reviewing, but there is nothing like a reality check, which we all successfully survived together in this environment. And again, as Shelley said, that is not just due to our own results, but also to tireless work by James and Mark. So we need to really thank them as well, and including everybody else doing their best to comply. I know that it's not easy to get your students who are still kids in our eyes, am I right, to comply. So thank you for the efforts. And it's been an honor for us to be part of this. Thank you.
And thank you for reminding me, Yelena, that I'm monitoring the college world very closely, both marching band and concert band indoors. And as of November 10th, 2020, there have been no documented transmissions of COVID-19 to other members of an ensemble, even though they have been present. And I want to point that out. We have had COVID positive students in band rehearsals, but no other band members were infected. So at least anecdotally showing that the mitigations are working in real life.
It's fantastic. Well, to close out, I want to thank everybody for being on the call today. Mark, as always, my partner in crime and the co-chair, I appreciate everything that you are doing to keep this thing moving forward. Dr. Miller, Dr. Sherbrink, I want to thank you guys so much for everything you've done with your research teams. I know that people will watch this and they will be ecstatic with the information that's coming out, and know that what they're doing is working, and that we're excited to finalize this study and be able to show that, you know, we've done something huge in the last 6 months. So I want to thank everybody for being on the call today. If you have any questions, check out the NFHS website with the study information on it. That'll get you to the information to submit questions and other things, as well as just read the questions. One caveat I put in there, because we all get way too many emails, read the FAQs first before you submit an FAQ and before you send an email. Otherwise, if it's not on there, by all means, contact us. But try to contact myself and Mark first without reaching out to our research team. We want to keep their focus on the science. And then if Mark and I we can consolidate a lot of questions together, get them all answered in one shot, and that way we're not taking so much of our research time's team answering questions. But again, check out those websites, and we thank you very much and wish you best of luck and health as we get into the holiday season and going from outdoor to indoor activity. Thank you, and enjoy your fall.
Thank you, James, too.
Thank you.